You ever notice how the quiet ones never explain themselves? The voice came low and casual over the hum of generators and the distant whine of rotor blades, cutting through the dry afternoon air like a thought no one wanted to finish, and for a moment no one answered, because out on Range Sector C, under a hard blue sky and a heat shimmer that bent the horizon, something about the scene didn't sit right, not with the wind flags barely moving, not with the line of young soldiers pretending not to stare, and definitely not with the old man standing alone. Near the edge of the inspection lane as if he had always belonged there, his name was Robert Hayes, though no one here seemed to know it yet, and he wore a faded field jacket that looked older than most of the men watching him, the fabric worn thin at the cuffs, a small, weathered patch stitched unevenly over the chest, the kind of thing you'd overlook unless you knew what you were looking for, and that was the problem. No one here thought it was worth looking at, Corporal Ethan Cole did, but not in the way that mattered. He saw an inconvenience, a break in routine, something out of place in a system he trusted because it was simple and clear, rank, order, control, and the old man didn't fit any of that, not with his silence, not with the way he stood just slightly angled into the wind like he was reading something no one else could see. "You lost, sir." Cole had said earlier, the word sir carrying no weight, just a habit wrapped in impatience, and Hayes hadn't answered, not because he didn't hear, but because he didn't need to, his gaze fixed somewhere past the runway, past the chain-link fence, like the present moment was just another checkpoint he'd already crossed years ago. That was when the shift happened, subtle at first, a tightening in Cole's posture, a glance over his shoulder at the other soldiers, a smirk forming as if he needed them to see this, to confirm that he was the one in control here, and then the space between them closed too quickly, not dramatic, not loud, just a brief, careless contact that should have meant nothing but didn't, because Hayes didn't react, didn't step back, didn't raise his voice. He just absorbed it the same way he absorbed the heat and the stares and the low laughter that followed, and that stillness, that refusal to play the part everyone expected, hung heavier than any confrontation. "You think this is some kind of museum?" Cole said, louder now, feeding off the attention, his words sharp but shallow, the kind that sound bigger than they are, and a few of the younger troops chuckled, shifting their weight, grateful not to be the one being noticed, while a lieutenant off to the side hesitated just long enough to register that something felt off before deciding it wasn't his problem. Hayes's eyes lifted then, not fast, not challenging, just steady, meeting Cole's for a fraction of a second, and in that moment there was no anger, no fear, just a depth that didn't belong to this place or this time, something that made the air feel thinner, like standing at altitude without realizing it. Specialist Daniel Brooks noticed it, though he couldn't say why. He'd been checking inventory on a tablet, half listening, half ignoring, until that look snapped his attention into place, and then he saw the details others missed. The way Hayes's boots were worn but perfectly maintained, the way his stance wasn't casual but precise, balanced, the way that patch, that small, almost meaningless piece of cloth, didn't quite match anything in the standard registry he'd memorized during training. Brooks frowned, a slow unease building in his chest, because he'd heard stories, not official ones, but the kind passed down in quiet corners, about men who didn't carry their records on paper, men whose names didn't show up in the systems until someone important started asking the right questions. Behind them, a transport chopper lifted off, its rotor wash kicking dust across the tarmac, rattling loose gravel against metal barriers, but Hayes didn't blink, didn't shift, as if the noise belonged to a different world entirely, and that was when Brooks made a decision he couldn't quite justify, his hand moving to his phone, not openly, not enough to draw attention, just enough to step a few paces back and angle himself away from the group. "Hey," Cole said. Again, leaning in, trying to reclaim the moment that was slipping from him, "I'm talking to you," but the words landed flat this time, because the dynamic had changed in a way no one could explain yet, like a pressure system rolling in without warning. Brooks scrolled through his contacts, bypassing the obvious choices, his thumb hovering for a split second before selecting a number he hadn't used in months, a direct line he'd been told never to use unless something was seriously wrong, and as the call connected, his eyes flicked back to Hayes, to the patch, to the silence that seemed to grow louder with every passing second, and he realized, with a cold clarity that settled deep in his gut, that whatever this was, it wasn't small, it wasn't local, and it definitely wasn't under control anymore. The line stayed quiet after Brooks made the call, Not the comfortable kind of quiet but the kind that settles in before something shifts, and even the wind seemed to hesitate, brushing lightly across the range flags as if testing the air. Corporal Ethan Cole exhaled through his nose and gave a short laugh that did not reach his eyes, glancing around to make sure the others were still with him, still seeing what he wanted them to see, an old man out of place, nothing more, and for a second a few of the soldiers nodded, unsure but unwilling to break formation, because confidence, even when it is thin, has a way of pulling people along with it. You are still standing here, Cole said, slower now, measuring his words as if the situation had somehow become a performance he could still control, which means you either did not hear me or you are choosing not to, and the emphasis on the last word hung there, waiting for a reaction that never came. Robert Hayes did not answer, his gaze shifting slightly, not toward Cole, not toward the group, but toward the far end of the runway where heat waves danced above the concrete, and there was something deliberate in that stillness, something that made it feel less like defiance and more like distance, like he was listening to a different frequency altogether. Lieutenant Aaron Wells took a step forward and then stopped himself, his instincts pulling him in two directions, one trained to maintain order, the other quietly warning him that this did not feel like a standard situation, and he found himself studying Hayes more carefully now, noticing the details he had dismissed before, the straightness of his posture, the absence of tension in his shoulders, the way his hands rested at his sides without the restless movement of someone uncertain or afraid. Behind them, Brooks turned slightly away from the group, lowering his voice as the call connected. "Sir, this is Specialist Brooks, Range Sector C, I need to confirm something," he said, keeping his tone even, controlled, because panic would not help here, and on the other end there was a pause, then a voice he recognized immediately, calm, precise, the kind that did not waste words. "Go ahead," and Brooks hesitated just long enough to choose them carefully. "There is an individual on the range. Older male, no visible credentials, but he is wearing a patch I cannot place, and the behavior here is escalating." Another pause, longer this time, and Brooks could almost hear the shift in attention on the other end, the subtle tightening that meant this had just moved up in importance. Back on the line, Cole stepped closer again, not touching this time but close enough to crowd the space, his voice dropping, sharper now. "Last warning," he said, though it sounded more like he was trying to convince himself than anyone else, and for the first time there was a flicker of something uncertain behind the confidence, because Hayes still had not reacted, not in the way Cole understood, not in a way that gave him anything to push against. One of the younger soldiers shifted his weight and looked away, the earlier smirks fading, replaced by a quiet discomfort that spread through the group like a ripple, subtle but undeniable, and Lieutenant Wells noticed it, felt it. The cohesion of the moment beginning to slip as doubt crept in. Hayes finally moved, but only slightly, turning his head just enough to bring Cole fully into his line of sight, and when he spoke, his voice was low, steady, carrying without effort. "You are standing in a place that has rules. You do not see," he said, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a simple statement of fact, and that, more than anything, unsettled Cole, because it did not challenge him, it did not argue, it simply existed, leaving no room for him to assert control. Brooks listened as the voice on the phone came back, no longer neutral, now focused. "Describe the patch," and Brooks swallowed, his eyes locking onto the worn stitching on Hayes's jacket. "It is faded, circular, looks like it was hand stitched, not standard issue. I have never seen it in any unit registry." Another pause, shorter this time, followed by a quiet exhale that did not belong in a routine call. "Stay where you are," the voice said, firmer now, "do not escalate, and do not let anyone else escalate," and then the line went silent. Brooks lowered the phone slowly, his pulse picking up, because he had heard that tone before, not often, but enough to recognize it, the moment when something ordinary stops being ordinary. When a name or a symbol connects to something larger than the immediate situation. Across the range, a distant engine note changed pitch as a vehicle altered course, barely noticeable unless you were listening for it, and Hayes's gaze shifted again, just slightly, as if he had been expecting it all along, while around him the air seemed to tighten, the casual energy of the group giving way to a quiet, growing awareness that whatever was about to happen next was already in motion and no longer belonged to them. The change did not arrive with noise, it arrived with absence, a subtle thinning of the background chatter across the range as radios that had been casually crackling a moment ago went quiet one by one. not switched off but deliberately silenced, and that alone was enough for Lieutenant Wells to feel the shift settle into his chest, because routine never disappeared like that unless something above his level had taken notice. Corporal Ethan Cole felt it too, though he could not name it, only that the rhythm he had been controlling a moment earlier was slipping through his fingers, and he tried to reclaim it the only way he knew how, by stepping closer again, drawing a breath as if to speak, then stopping when he realized that no one behind him was reacting the same way anymore, the earlier smirks gone, replaced by a stillness that did not belong to a training day. Robert Hayes did not move, but his presence seemed to take up more space now, not physically, but in the way the air arranged itself around him, and his eyes drifted past Cole once more, not dismissive, not avoiding, simply uninterested in the surface of the moment, as if he had already seen where it led. Across the tarmac, a utility vehicle slowed as it approached the outer perimeter and then stopped completely, the driver remaining inside, engine idling, waiting for instructions that had not yet been spoken aloud, and Brooks caught that detail, the hesitation, the way trained personnel paused instead of proceeding, and it confirmed what he already felt, that whatever chain he had triggered with that call had reached further than he expected. His phone vibrated once in his hand, a single pulse. And when he glanced down he saw no message, just a secure channel indicator lighting briefly before going dark again, a silent acknowledgement that someone, somewhere, had received the information and was already acting on it. "What did you do?" one of the younger soldiers whispered under his breath, not accusing, just confused, and Brooks did not answer, because there was nothing he could say that would make sense yet. Lieutenant Wells took another step forward, this time not toward Hayes, but slightly to the side, positioning himself where he could see both the group and the approach road, his training finally overriding hesitation, because even without full information he understood one thing clearly: control was no longer local, and that meant his role had shifted from enforcing to observing. Cole noticed that movement and frowned, the first visible crack in his confidence. "Lieutenant," he said, expecting reinforcement, expecting structure, but Wells did not immediately respond. His attention fixed on the distance where a low, steady hum was beginning to build, not loud, not dramatic, just enough to register as something larger than the usual traffic of the base. Hayes's head tilted almost imperceptibly, as if aligning with that sound, and for a brief moment the years seemed to fall away from him, not in appearance, but in presence, the stillness sharpening into something focused, something that carried memory without needing to show it. The hum grew slightly, resolving into the distinct rhythm of approaching aircraft, not one, but multiple, spaced in a pattern that was too precise to be routine, and even those who did not recognize it felt the difference, the way the air pressure shifted, the way conversations died completely as everyone instinctively looked up. Brooks's pulse quickened, because he had heard that pattern before during exercises that were not announced, operations that required immediate response without explanation, and he realized with a clarity that left no room for doubt that the call he made had not just been received, it had been escalated to a level where movement happened first and questions came later. Cole followed the other's gaze, squinting against the glare as distant shapes began to form against the sky, his expression tightening, not yet fear, but no longer certainty, and he took a half step back without meaning to, as if his body was adjusting before his mind could catch up. Hayes remained where he was, unchanged, his jacket stirring slightly in the wind kicked up by the approaching aircraft, the worn patch on his chest catching the light for just a second before fading back into the fabric, and Brooks found himself staring at it again, trying to place it, trying to connect it to something concrete, but the harder he looked, the more it felt like a fragment of a larger story he had never been told. Lieutenant Wells exhaled slowly, making a decision that felt both small and irreversible. "Everyone hold position," he said, his voice controlled but lower than before, not commanding the situation so much as stabilizing it. And no one argued, not even Cole, because the sound overhead was now unmistakable, the synchronized approach of aircraft that did not divert, did not circle, did not wait, but came straight in on a line that pointed directly toward them, and in that moment, standing on the open stretch of range Sector C with the sun high and the wind shifting and the silence complete, it became clear to everyone present that whatever had been set in motion was no longer a question of what would happen next, but how quickly it would arrive. The first helicopter did not circle, it did not request clearance over the open channel, it came straight in on a shallow descent path that cut across the sky with deliberate precision, followed by two more in perfect spacing, their rotor wash pushing the dry Air ahead of them in long, rolling waves that swept across Range Sector C and flattened the scattered dust along the tarmac. The sound built not into chaos but into a controlled, synchronized rhythm, the kind that signaled coordination at a level far beyond routine operations, and every trained instinct on the field recognized it before anyone said a word. Lieutenant Wells stood completely still now, his earlier hesitation gone, replaced by a quiet understanding that this moment no longer belonged to him, and when he glanced toward the perimeter he saw additional movement, vehicles that had been parked along service roads repositioning in silence, not rushing, not reacting, but aligning, as if responding to a set of instructions already understood without being spoken. Specialist Brooks felt his throat tighten slightly as he watched it unfold, because he had never seen a response like this triggered so quickly, not without alarms, not without briefings, and yet here it was. Unfolding in real time, seamless and controlled, like a system waking up from a dormant state. Corporal Ethan Cole took another step back, this time without realizing it at all, his eyes fixed on the descending aircraft, the earlier confidence drained from his posture as he tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed he understood about authority and response. Because nothing in his training had prepared him for this kind of escalation without warning, the helicopters touched down one by one along the far edge of the range, not kicking up chaos but settling with practiced control, their rotors continuing to turn as figures emerged from the doors, moving with purpose, not hurried, not aggressive, but precise, each step measured, each movement part of a larger pattern that no one on the ground had been briefed on. Robert Hayes did not turn to watch them, not immediately, his gaze still directed outward as if the arrival had already been accounted for in his mind long before the sound reached anyone else, and when he finally shifted his eyes, it was not toward the aircraft themselves but toward the line of approach where the figures were now advancing, his expression unchanged. Calm, almost expectant. Brooks noticed that and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind, because it suggested something deeper than coincidence, something that connected Hayes to what was happening in a way that defied the simple explanation of a mistaken identity or a misplaced civilian. One of the younger soldiers swallowed hard and whispered, "This is not normal," the words barely audible, but no one disagreed, because normal did not shut down movement across an entire sector. Without a single raised voice, Lieutenant Wells drew a slow breath and straightened slightly, not in preparation to take control, but in recognition of it being taken from him, and he found his attention drawn back to Hayes again, to the stillness that had started this chain of events, to the quiet presence that now seemed to anchor everything unfolding around them. Cole followed that same line of sight, his focus shifting from the helicopters to the man standing in front of him, and for the first time since the encounter began, there was no smirk, no challenge in his expression, only a growing awareness that he had misread something fundamental, something that could not be corrected with words or posture. The approaching figures closed the distance steadily, their uniforms catching the light in brief flashes, insignia not yet visible but unmistakably high-ranking in the way others on the field subtly adjusted their stance without being told, small, instinctive movements that signaled recognition before confirmation. The rotors continued to turn behind them, the steady thump-thump-thump echoing across the open space, but even that sound seemed to recede into the background as the focus narrowed to the line between Hayes and the advancing group. Brooks shifted his weight slightly, resisting the urge to step back, because he knew this was the moment where everything would either clarify or become even more complicated, and he forced himself to stay exactly where he was, exactly as instructed. The distance between the 2 points closed to less than 20 yards, then 10, and still Hayes did not move to meet them, did not step forward or signal acknowledgement. He simply stood, as if the ground beneath him marked a boundary that others would have to cross, and as the leading figure came fully into view, the sunlight catching the edges of his insignia for just a fraction of a second, a quiet realization passed through everyone present at the same time, not spoken, not announced, but understood, that whatever this moment was about to reveal had already begun long before anyone on this range realized they were part of it. The leading officer slowed as he approached, not out of hesitation but with the kind of controlled precision that signaled intent, his boots striking the tarmac in a steady cadence that carried authority without needing to announce it, and as he came fully into view the insignia on his uniform caught the light in sharp, unmistakable lines, for stars aligned across his shoulders, followed closely by 2 others bearing the same rank, each step synchronized not by command but by shared understanding. The air seemed to compress around their Arrival, not with force but with presence, and across range sector see every soldier instinctively straightened, some snapping to attention without realizing it, others simply freezing where they stood, because this was not a visit, not an inspection, this was something else entirely. Lieutenant Wells felt his spine lock into place, his earlier uncertainty replaced by a clarity that came too late to matter, and he lowered his gaze for a fraction of a second in acknowledgement before returning it. Forward, aware now that he was witnessing something far outside his authority, Specialist Brooks stood rigid, his pulse loud in his ears, watching as the three generals closed the final distance, his earlier call echoing in his mind with a weight he had not anticipated, because whatever he had triggered had not just been verified, it had been validated at the highest level. Corporal Ethan Cole did not move at all, his body caught between instinct and disbelief, his eyes fixed on the approaching figures and then shifting, almost involuntarily, back to Robert Hayes, as if trying to reconcile the quiet man he had dismissed with the reality now unfolding in front of him. Hayes remained exactly where he had been, his posture unchanged, his expression calm, as if the arrival of 3 four-star generals onto an active range was neither surprising nor disruptive, but simply the next step in a sequence already set in motion. The lead general stopped 5 feet from Hayes, close enough that the details of his uniform, the crisp lines, the precise placement of every insignia, stood in stark contrast to the worn fabric of Hayes's jacket, and for a moment there was no movement, no sound beyond the distant hum of rotors still turning behind them. Then, in a motion so deliberate it seemed to slow time itself, the general raised his hand in a sharp, flawless salute, the kind executed only when protocol and respect aligned completely, and the 2 generals beside him followed instantly, their movements synchronized with exact precision. The effect rippled outward across the range, soldiers who had been watching in stunned silence snapping into position as if pulled by an invisible thread. Boots aligning, shoulders squaring, eyes forward, because the meaning of that gesture was unmistakable, even to those who did not yet understand its cause. Brooks felt the breath leave his chest in a slow exhale he had not realized he was holding, because in that single action every doubt, every question, every fragment of unease had been answered without a single word. Cole's mouth opened slightly, then closed again, no sound coming out, because there was nothing in his training, nothing in his experience, that could explain why 3 of the highest-ranking officers in the United States military were standing at attention in front of the man he had just dismissed. Hayes looked at them, his gaze steady, not surprised, not proud, simply acknowledging, and for a brief moment something passed between them that no one else could see, not a signal, not a command, but a recognition that carried weight far beyond rank or position. The lead general lowered his salute slowly, his hand returning to his side with measured control, and when he spoke his voice was quiet, controlled, but carried across the space with absolute clarity. "Sir," he said, the single word landing with more force than any order could have, and in that instant the entire dynamic of the scene shifted completely. Hayes inclined his head slightly, the smallest of movements, yet it carried a gravity that held the attention of every person present, and the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, no longer tense, it was absolute, filled with the understanding that whatever had been hidden beneath the surface of this moment had now been revealed, and nothing that had come before it could remain the same. For a few seconds after the word left the general's mouth, no one moved, not because they were ordered to remain still, but because the meaning of that single word had not fully settled yet. It lingered in the air like something heavy and irreversible, reshaping the space around it, and Lieutenant Wells felt it more than heard it, the quiet acknowledgement that whatever authority he thought he held here had just been eclipsed entirely. Specialist Brooks kept his eyes forward, but his mind was racing, replaying every second leading up to this moment, every detail he had noticed and almost dismissed, now snapping into place with a clarity that made his chest tighten, because this was no longer a question of who Hayes was, it was a question of how far above everything else he stood. Corporal Ethan Cole remained frozen where he was, his earlier posture gone, replaced by a rigid stillness that came from trying to process something his instincts could not categorize, his gaze fixed on the 3 generals, then shifting back to Hayes, then back again, as if repetition might somehow make the scene align with his expectations, but it did not, and the gap between what he thought he understood and what was actually happening grew wider with every passing second. The lead general took a small step forward, closing the distance by less than a foot, not enough to invade space, just enough to signal intent, and when he spoke again his voice remained controlled, steady, but now carried something deeper, something that sounded less like protocol and more like respect that had been waiting a long time to be expressed. "We have been trying to locate you," he said, each word measured, deliberate, for a very long time, and that sentence alone sent a ripple through everyone within earshot, because it suggested history, connection, and significance that extended far beyond the boundaries of this base. Hayes listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in his eyes, not surprise, not even acknowledgement in the traditional sense, just a quiet understanding that the past had finally caught up with the present in a way that could not be avoided. Behind the generals, the rotors of the helicopters continued their steady rhythm, but even that sound seemed distant now, as if the entire environment had narrowed to the exchange happening at the center of the range. One of the other generals, slightly older, his posture just as precise, spoke next, his tone carrying a weight that came from personal memory rather than rank. "You were not supposed to disappear," he said. And there was no accusation in it, only a statement that hinted at something unresolved, something that had remained open for decades. Brooks felt a chill move through him, because that kind of language did not belong to routine military interaction, it belonged to something else entirely, something classified, something buried. Cole swallowed hard, the sound almost inaudible, his throat dry as he tried to form a thought that made sense of what he was hearing, but nothing came. Because the situation had moved beyond explanation, Hayes finally spoke, his voice low, calm, carrying the same steady weight it had from the beginning. "Some things were meant to stay buried," he said, not as a refusal, not as a challenge, but as a simple truth, and the effect of that sentence was immediate, the three generals exchanging a brief glance that lasted less than a second but conveyed more than any extended conversation could. Lieutenant Wells noticed that glance, recognized it for what it was, a silent agreement between individuals who understood the full scope of something others did not, and he felt a quiet certainty settle in, that whatever Hayes had been involved in was not just important, it was foundational to something much larger. The lead general nodded once, slowly, as if acknowledging both the statement and the weight behind it, and when he spoke again his voice dropped slightly, not in volume, but in tone, carrying a gravity that pressed into the silence around them. "With respect, sir, some things do not stay buried forever," he said, and the way he emphasized the last word made it clear that this was not a negotiation, it was a recognition of reality. Hayes held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked past him briefly, toward the horizon he had been watching since the beginning, and when his eyes returned there was a faint shift, not resignation, not acceptance, but something closer to acknowledgement that the moment had arrived whether he had wanted it to or not. Around them, every soldier remained perfectly still, the earlier confusion replaced by a collective understanding that they were witnessing something that would not be explained, something that would not be written in reports or discussed in briefings, but would remain with them long after this day ended, because in the span of a few minutes, the quiet man they had overlooked had been revealed not just as someone important, but as someone the highest levels of command stood before with respect that could not be faked, and in that realization, the balance of everything they thought they knew shifted completely. The silence held longer this time, not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything that needed to be understood had already been placed on the ground between them, visible to those who knew how to see it, and Robert Hayes did not rush to fill it, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged, as if he had spent a lifetime standing in moments exactly like this, where words mattered less than what they carried. The lead general drew a slow breath, his eyes not leaving Hayes, and there was something in his expression now that went beyond command, something personal, something that had been buried beneath years of protocol and distance. "We owe you more than this," he said quietly, not as a formal statement, but as something closer to a confession, and the two generals beside him remained still, their presence reinforcing the weight of that admission without needing to echo it. Specialist Brooks felt the shift immediately, because this was no longer about identification or authority, it was about history, the kind that did not get written down in public records, the kind that existed only in fragments, in memories carried by those who had been there, and he realized with a sharp clarity that the patch on Hayes's jacket was not just a symbol, it was a key to something far larger than anyone on this range had imagined. Corporal Ethan Cole stood rigid, his earlier certainty completely gone now, replaced by a hollow awareness that he had stepped into something he did not understand, his eyes fixed on Hayes but unable to hold the gaze for long, because every instinct told him he was no longer in control of anything happening here. Lieutenant Wells remained at attention, his mind moving through the implications with the discipline of someone trained to assess quickly, and he understood now that this was not an incident to be corrected, it was a moment to be witnessed, one that would never be officially explained but would carry consequences all the same. Hayes shifted his weight slightly, the smallest movement, and for the first time since the generals arrived, he took a step forward, closing the distance by less than a foot, not to assert dominance, not to meet them halfway, but simply to acknowledge that the moment had reached its next point. His voice, when it came, was calm, measured, carrying the same quiet authority it had from the beginning. "You do not owe me anything," he said, and the simplicity of the statement cut through the tension more cleanly than any command could have, because it removed the expectation of repayment, of recognition, of closure. One of the generals, the oldest among them, let out a breath he had been holding, his shoulders easing just slightly, and when he spoke there was a trace of something that had nothing to do with rank. "That is not how we see it," he replied, his tone steady but firm, and the exchange that followed was not loud, not dramatic, but carried a depth that made every person within earshot feel the gravity of it without fully understanding why. Behind them, the base continued to hold in a kind of suspended state, vehicles idle, radios quiet, movement reduced to the absolute minimum, as if the entire installation had been placed on pause to allow this single moment to unfold without interference. Brooks glanced briefly at the perimeter and saw personnel standing in place, waiting, not confused, not restless, just still, as if they too sensed that whatever was happening here took precedence over everything else. Cole swallowed again. His hands now at his sides, no longer clenched, no longer expressive, simply still, and in that stillness there was a realization forming, slow but unavoidable, that the man he had dismissed, the man he had treated as an inconvenience, was someone the highest levels of command addressed with a respect that could not be earned in a single lifetime under normal circumstances. Hayes looked at the three generals for a moment longer, then his gaze shifted slightly, not away, but outward, as if measuring something beyond the immediate conversation, and when he spoke again his words were softer, but no less clear. "The men who mattered are gone," he said, and the sentence settled into the air with a weight that silenced even the distant hum of the rotors in the background. The generals did not respond immediately, and that pause spoke volumes, because it confirmed what Brooks had begun to understand, that whatever Hayes had been part of, whatever unit or operation had left that mark on him, it belonged to a time and a place that no longer existed, at least not in any official capacity. Lieutenant Wells felt a quiet tension tighten in his chest, not from fear, but from the recognition that he was standing at the edge of something that would never be fully explained, and he held his position, eyes forward, because that was the only appropriate response left, and in the center of it all, Robert Hayes stood exactly as he had from the beginning, unchanged, unmoved by the scale of the reaction around him, as if the world had finally caught up to him for a brief moment, only to realize that it still had not quite reached where he had been all along. The weight of Hayes's last words lingered in the air long after they were spoken, not because they were loud or forceful, but because they carried a finality that none of the men in uniform could easily counter, and for a moment even the three generals, men accustomed to command and decision, seemed to stand within that silence rather than over it. The lead general shifted his stance slightly, not breaking posture, but grounding himself as if preparing to say something that had been held back for years. "They may be gone," he said, his voice steady but edged with something deeper, but what they stood for did not disappear with them, and that statement did not challenge Hayes, it met him, acknowledging the loss while refusing to let it define the present. Robert Hayes watched him, his eyes narrowing just enough to suggest thought rather than resistance, and for the first time there was a subtle change in the stillness he carried, not a weakening, but a shift, like a door that had remained closed for decades being tested at the hinges. Specialist Brooks felt it immediately, the tone of the exchange moving from recognition to something more, something that carried the weight of unfinished business, and he realized that this was no longer about confirming identity or showing respect. This was about bringing something back into the light that had been deliberately left in the dark. Corporal Ethan Cole stood motionless, his earlier presence completely dissolved, because the conversation unfolding in front of him had moved beyond anything he could follow, each word layered with meaning he did not have the context to understand, and yet he could feel its importance all the same, pressing into the space around him. The Second General stepped forward slightly, his voice lower, more measured. There are records that do not exist in any system, he said, operations that were never acknowledged, names that were never listed, and as he spoke his eyes remained fixed on Hayes, not searching, not questioning, but confirming, and Brooks felt a chill run through him because that kind of statement did not belong to official channels, it belonged to the edges of them, to the places where the rules changed. Hayes did not respond immediately, his gaze drifting for a moment toward the horizon once more, as if measuring the distance between what had been and what was now being asked of him, and when he finally spoke his voice carried a quiet weariness that had not been there before. That was the point, he said, and the simplicity of the answer struck harder than any detailed explanation could have. Because it confirmed everything without revealing anything, Lieutenant Wells felt the significance of that exchange settle into his understanding with a clarity that made him hold his breath, because it meant that whatever Hayes had been part of was not just classified, it was designed to remain invisible, to exist without acknowledgement even from the system it served. The lead general nodded slowly, accepting the answer without pressing it further, and when he spoke again his tone shifted, not softer, but more direct. "We are not here to expose it," he said, "we are here because it matters that you are recognized," and that word, recognized, carried a different weight than anything said before, because it was not about information, it was about acknowledgement, about ensuring that what had been done was not lost entirely to silence. Hayes looked at him for a long moment, and in that pause there was a tension that had nothing to do with rank or protocol, but with choice, with the decision of whether to remain where he had been or step into something he had left behind. Around them, the base remained in its suspended state, every movement minimal, every sound subdued, as if the entire environment was waiting for that decision to be made. Brooks realized then that this was the turning point, not for the situation, but for Hayes himself, the moment where the past and present intersected in a way that could not be ignored. Cole felt it too, though he could not articulate it, only that something irreversible was about to happen, something that would redefine everything he had assumed about the man standing in front of him. Hayes finally exhaled, a slow, measured breath, and when he spoke his voice carried the same calm authority as before, but now with a trace of something else beneath it. Something closer to acceptance. "Recognition does not change what happened," he said, and the words hung there, not dismissive, not resistant, but grounded in a reality that could not be rewritten. The generals did not argue, did not attempt to counter the statement, because they understood that truth, and in that shared understanding the moment shifted again, moving from confrontation to something quieter, something more final. As if the purpose of their arrival was no longer to convince, but simply to stand in acknowledgement of a man who had never needed it, and yet deserved it all the same. The air did not return to normal immediately, not after everything that had just unfolded, because moments like this did not simply end, they settled, slowly, into the memory of everyone who witnessed them, and as the last words faded, Robert Hayes stood in the same quiet space he had occupied from the beginning, unchanged by the scale of what had just surrounded him. The lead general held his gaze for a final second, then gave a single, deliberate nod, not as an order, not as a conclusion, but as acknowledgement, the kind that carried weight without needing to be spoken aloud, and he stepped back, not turning away immediately, not breaking the connection too quickly, as if recognizing that this was not a moment to be rushed. The two generals beside him followed, their movements precise, respectful, the formation they had arrived in dissolving just enough to signal that the purpose of their presence had been fulfilled, and yet none of them looked anywhere else, their attention still centered on Hayes, because even in departure, the respect remained. Specialist Brooks felt the shift ripple outward, subtle but unmistakable, the way the base itself seemed to begin breathing again, systems reactivating, radios clicking softly back to life, distant movement resuming in controlled increments, but no one on the range moved yet, no one spoke, because the silence that remained was no longer imposed, it was chosen. Lieutenant Wells lowered his gaze briefly, then brought it forward again, his posture still rigid, but his understanding completely altered, because whatever protocol he had followed up to this point had just been rewritten in front of him without a single directive being issued. Corporal Ethan Cole stood exactly where he had been, but everything about him had changed, the confidence that had defined him earlier replaced by a quiet, heavy awareness that did not need to be explained, his eyes no longer searching for control, but fixed on the ground for a moment before lifting slowly back toward Hayes, as if trying to understand something that could not be undone. Hayes did not linger on the generals as they stepped away, did not follow their movement, his attention already shifting back toward the horizon he had watched from the start, and in that motion there was no dismissal, no rejection, only a return to the place he had never really left, the quiet distance where recognition did not define him. One of the generals paused just before turning fully away, his voice carrying across the short distance, steady and clear. "Sir," he said again, and this time there was no response expected, no conversation to follow, just the reaffirmation of something that had been established beyond doubt. Hayes inclined his head slightly, the smallest acknowledgement, and that was enough. The generals turned then, their steps measured as they moved back toward the waiting aircraft, the rotors still turning in patient rhythm, and as they walked, the structure of the base began to reassert itself. Personnel shifting back into motion, vehicles resuming their routes, the controlled flow of activity returning piece by piece, but none of it felt quite the same as it had before. Brooks exhaled slowly, the tension easing from his shoulders, but the weight of what he had seen remained, settling into something that would stay with him long after this day, because he understood now that there were layers to the world he operated in that he had only just glimpsed. Wells gave a quiet command for the unit to stand easy, his voice steady, but even that sounded different, tempered by what had just occurred, and the soldiers responded not with the casual movement of routine, but with a measured restraint, as if still aware that something significant had taken place. Cole hesitated, then took a single step back, creating space where there had been none before, his eyes lowering briefly before lifting again, not in defiance, not in confidence, but in recognition, the kind that came too late to change what had happened, but just in time to understand it. Hayes remained where he was for a moment longer, the wind catching the edge of his worn jacket, the faded patch shifting slightly against the fabric. And then, without announcement, without drawing attention, he turned and began to walk, his pace steady, unhurried, moving along the edge of the range as if he had somewhere to be that did not require explanation. No one stopped him, no one called out, because there was nothing left to say, and as he moved away, the distance between him and the rest of the base seemed to return to what it had always been, not measured in feet or yards, but in something far less tangible, something defined by experience, by memory, by a life that had already been lived. Beyond the need for recognition, and in the quiet that followed, as the last of the helicopters lifted off and the sound faded into the sky, a single understanding remained with everyone who had been there, unspoken but clear, that respect was never something you demanded in the moment, it was something earned long before anyone thought to question it, and remembered long after the moment had passed.